Good morning. I hope everybody's had a good week. I hope you've enjoyed some sunshine along with the rainy days that we've had. But it's good that you're here. I'm glad to be here. I'm glad that you turned on your device and decided to join in with Sunday School today. So we're going to be in session 1 of our new quarterly Explore the Bible. If you don't have this book, then you can join and follow along in Proverbs chapter 3. Our lesson is entitled Direction Offered. Sometimes we ask direction, a lot of times we should and we don't, but this is about direction that is offered. Now last week we studied the first part of chapter 1 in Proverbs. In the second part of chapter 1, Solomon gave wisdom the personification of a woman calling out in the city. It seemed a little bit strange in this male-dominated culture that wisdom would take on the person of a woman, but she was given godly authority. She spoke of wisdom versus foolishness and right living instead of sinfulness. In Solomon's description in these verses, this lady wisdom walked around calling out in public places such as the marketplace, which indicated it was not hidden. She was out in public. It was there. Wisdom was there, available for all who would listen for it. And then in chapter 2 of Proverbs, Solomon speaks more to those who are definitely willing to listen. Verses 1 through 5 concentrate on the wisdom. And remember, the purpose of Proverbs was not to offer just knowledge, but to take that knowledge and apply it to our lives. That's the wisdom that he is asking or hoping that his son would attain. In verses 6 through 8 of chapter 2, he speaks of courage because God is mentioned as the shield and the guard. And in verses 9 through 15, speaks of justice or a right way of living. In other words, you're going to stand by your covenant or the words, the vows that you make. He shows in this part of Proverbs what an advantage it will be to accept wisdom. And it would allow us, if you accept wisdom, help us to ward off the snares of evil men and wayward women, as even mentioned in chapter 2. So today, we're going to begin in chapter 3, and we'll cover verses 1 through 12. These verses are arranged in 6 quatrains. A quatrain is like a poem that has 4 lines. Used here, the first verse of the group, which would be the odd-numbered verse, makes up the first 2 lines of the quatrain, and it gives us a direction. And the following verse, which would be the even-numbered one, would be the last 2 lines of the poem, and it gives the result of following through with the direction in the first part. So our scripture is now going to start with verse 1. My son, forget not my law, but let thine heart keep my commandments. That is the directive that he's given. Since the writing of the 10 Commandments, God's people had been instructed to honor their parents. And Solomon was not asking his son to just honor the parents, but or just merely memorize the law, the law, when he speaks of it, as the 10 Commandments, but to put it in his heart. What we hold near and dear to our heart is what we're going to put into practice in our lives every day. And then in verse 2, we get the result of this directive. For length of days and long life and peace shall they add to these. The results of keeping the law, a long life, but it's not measured in the number of days. A short life does not mean that you've been a disobedient person or that you have disobeyed God or you have not tried to live by the law or the commandments. So we're not really measuring the days, the number of days in our life, but we want to measure the life that we have in the number of days that we have. And that life would be one that has a sense of peace and a sense of wholeness, a good relationship with God, a good relationship with ourselves. Sometimes we're our own worst critic, and a good relationship with others. So that was the promise. Not that we're all going to live to be 150 years old, but that we're going to have a life that's full of these qualities, which make it a wonderful life. And in verses 3 and 4, we go to the second quatrain. And the directive is this: let not mercy and truth forsake thee. Bind them about thy neck, and write them upon the table of thy heart. So shalt thou find favor and good understanding in the sight of God and man. Verse 3 focuses on two characteristics of God, and this is our directive verse. And those characteristics are mercy and truth. Or in the NIV translation that you may have, you might see the words loyalty and faithfulness. God's covenant consisted of a selfless love, a kindness, and mercy and grace. And thank goodness for us that it does supply mercy and grace. And when we show these same characteristics to others, that's a way of expressing our love to God, because He has shown us mercy and grace and kindness and love. Then that's how we show it. We honor Him by showing that to other people in our lives. This was the directive, and also the way that we would live out this directive was consistently, not every now and then with people that we really like or that are close to us, but in every aspect of our lives, to everyone in our lives. To the Israelites, the heart was the place of the human will and decision making. Now, we probably think it's in our head, but to them it was in your heart. So Solomon encouraged his sons to write these traits in his heart so that they were there in his storehouse of beliefs and commitment, but also not just to keep it in his heart, but to wear it around his neck, and that would make it evident in his lifestyle. In other words, let these characteristics show everywhere that you go through your life. And in verse 4, the outcome of this kind of life would be to find favor and good understanding with God, which would lead to harmony with others. And heaven knows we need some harmony, a good dose of harmony in our world and in our country right now. Now, God sees what's in our hearts. He can tell the pure motives. He can tell sometimes our actions are misinterpreted, but God knows what's in our hearts. And He looks favorably on the priorities that we have if those priorities are in the correct order. But now people in our lives can't see our hearts. But what they do is they hear our words and they watch our actions. That's why Solomon said it was so important to wear it like a necklace so that everyone sees it. A life of integrity, doing what is right, would lead to a life that's worthy of respect by other men. Now, there's one mandate for a right relationship with God, and that is to trust Him. And if you think about it, you really can't have much of any kind of a relationship with anybody without trust. But this trust is mentioned in verse 5. It says, trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not into thine own understanding. This trust in God is more than just a mental wish or a half-hearted hope. It's a trust with every cell of our being, down to the very core of our existence. Foolish people rely on their own faith and on their own doing, and they bank on their own wisdom. The wisdom that Solomon wishes his son to have comes from acknowledging God, first of all, and then allowing God to have a say in every aspect of our lives. Our lives are constantly changing and moving. That's the only thing that's permanent, is that everything changes. And how we live our life puts us on one of two paths. We're either living toward our God-given reason for even being here, or we're heading down a road that gives us eternal separation from God. So the trust in God is what our directive is about in verse 5. And then in verse 6, the benefit is addressed, and that is that God takes the twists and the turns. It says, in all thy ways acknowledge Him, and He shall direct thy paths. So God's going to take all the twists and the turns and the crooked paths of our life and the difficult situations and the problems, and He can turn them into victories and into guardrails. And guardrails are protection devices. So God is He can become our protection if we trust Him. Now, I was thinking about this when I read the word guardrail. Have you ever been driving down the highway and you got a little too far over to the right enough that you hit those rumble strips or sleeper lines or whatever you might want to call them? You probably didn't even realize that you were leaving the road until you felt that vibration and you heard the sound. God does us, I believe, like that. We slide a little off our path and He alerts us so that we don't hit the ditch. But I believe that He also corrects us sometimes before we even know that we're needing redirecting. He might correct us and we're back on a path where we never knew that we even left the path that we were traveling on. I think it's like we might do with a baby. He just silently steps in and gives us a gentle nudge into a different lane. And that's the benefit of trust in Him, the kind of trust that Solomon wants his son to have. Now, in verses 7 and 8, we go to another quatrain. Verse 7, of course, is the odd-numbered one. That gives us the direction. Be not wise in thine own eyes. Fear the Lord and depart from evil. When we have successes in our lives, sometimes we get enough pride that we develop an arrogant attitude. Having pride in our accomplishments is not wrong unless we think we've attained everything that we have without God's help, or that we are wise without God. In our study of Romans that we've just recently completed, you remember Paul warned the believers not to think more highly of themselves than they should. And Solomon is warning his son that same directive, not to be prideful, but to be fearful of the Lord. And fearful indicates that we're not afraid. Remember, in fear, you're either going to run from it or you're going to submit to it. Fearful here is indicating that it is a profound awareness of God's presence and His holiness, which makes it easier for us to steer away from evil lures and alternatives in life. Now, the reward for that is in verse 8. It shall be health to thy navel and marrow to thy bones. According to Solomon, by following this directive, it actually has a healing effect. The words navel and bones really point to the basic makeup of our physical body. In the NIV translation, which I know a lot of you have, and I read a copy of that too, it actually says body and bones. Now, that's not a blanket promise that people will not have health issues. And it's not a blanket promise or it's not an indication that if someone has a health issue that they have had this pride or arrogance. But a Christian lifestyle normally helps us avoid harmful products. It steers us away from sinful situations and from destructive and careless behavior. So we can and should, if we're sick, should seek medical help. But living in a right relationship with God gives us a peace and a hope that whatever issues we face, our lives rest in the hands of a great physician. We may have sicknesses, but trusting in the Lord can have a positive effect on our physical well-being as well as our spiritual growth, and having a positive outlook sometimes promotes healing. So we'll go over now to verses 9 and 10. 9 is the directive. Honor the Lord with thy substance and with the first fruits of all thine increase. So shall thy barns be filled with plenty, and thy presses shall burst out with new wine. To honor God means to know how important it is, His presence is in our lives. And we honor God with our minds when we study His Word and we seek His wisdom. And we try to apply that in our lives. We honor Him with our hearts by our devotion to Him. Now, the people of Israel counted on their fields and vineyards to produce what they needed. God provided the land. He gave them the land when He took them out of slavery in Egypt. He provided the seeds. He provided the sun and the rain season. It's not like our rain where we might get rain a shower or two a day or every other day. They had a rain season. And without that rain season, they had no crops. So to honor him for his provisions, the people gave the first fruits or the initial harvest, which was the best. Now, just recently, I picked some blueberries from a bush, and it was the first blueberries that were ripe, and they were the best. They were so big and plump and sweet. None of the blueberries that I've picked since then were quite as good. So they gave him of the first fruits of their harvest. Giving these first fruits demonstrated their honor, that they were giving him the best, and also their faith that he would provide a bountiful harvest. But what they gave to God came first. That was out of the harvest first. So they trusted that when they gave that he was going to provide a harvest. In verse 9 it says, the barns will be filled with the produce gathered in the harvest. A full barn gave them confidence that they would have enough to eat until the next harvest. Now, you might remember, I remember, maybe you remember your mother or your grandmother having a canning room or a pantry where you could go in and you could look at all the jars of fresh vegetables that had been canned and stored for the winter until the next garden season. Or out in the yard, you might remember a mound that was a sweet potato hill, and it would be filled with the sweet potatoes all the way to the little door that opened up into the mound. Or you might in the field have remembered stacks of peanuts, and you could go out and pick the peanuts when they dried and have roasted peanuts, or you could even make peanut brittle or use it in your cooking, a lot of times in the Christmas candies. And you might you may have smelled the smoke or the scent in a smokehouse where meat hung for the winter months. Now, you knew you were going to have food for the winter when you saw all these things around and about at your home. I'm sure I'm telling how old I am, but that's okay. It's been a good life. But you can imagine how your mothers and fathers or your grandmothers and your grandfathers felt when they knew they had provisions for their families, because winter is not a growing season, and they would be able to feed their children and their families all winter. Well, that's how the Israelites felt when they had their full barns, and that was what God promised when he gave, or Solomon encouraged his son to give the first fruits, because then God would fulfill his part of the covenant too. Now, the wine that was spoken of, wine was made from grapes, and it was a common drink in the ancient world, and sometimes it was actually safer to drink than stored water. They didn't have refrigeration, and they didn't have chlorine to keep the water clean. But this new wine that was mentioned in verse 10 came from the first drippings of juice from the grapes. They would take the grapes and they would put them in a vat, and the first juice that dripped out made the new wine. And I'm sure that must have been the best part. Well, after that, they would have workers walk on the grapes to squeeze out the rest of the juice. But the one that dripped out on its own was the new wine. That was the best. And for the presses, for it to say that the presses would burst out, or in the NIV translation, overflow, that meant that the stone vats that it was stored in would not lose any of the juice, because it was so sealed that there were no cracks and none of it would waste and go into the ground. So now we have to understand, though, that Solomon was not promising a guarantee of unlimited prosperity. We don't give to God what is due God because we want him to make us prosper. We give out of our sincere and our faithful honor to God, and our faith in knowing that he will provide for us. This promise in these verses was based on God's capability, not our wants, although he does have the means and the resources to not only supply what we need, but far beyond what we can imagine. And I'm going to tell you a personal little story. It's kind of silly, but when I was in college, I was going to borrow a quarter from my friend from Bladenboro, and she went to campus that day, and she was planning to borrow a quarter from me. we could live off of a quarter. We could get a drink and a pack of crackers with that much money. So we both were there with no quarter to spend and no quarter to loan. So we were in a pretty bad fix. That was going to be a long day on campus for us. And she happened to see a lady from her hometown walking across campus, and she was married. And my friend Teresa said, "Oh, we'll get 50 cents from her. We'll borrow 50 cents from her. She's married. Married women always have money." I don't know where she got that idea, but she thought that at the time. But we did ask her, and she gave us $1 and told us not to worry about paying her back. She must have had a husband that gave her an allowance every week. But anyway, we thought we had hit the jackpot. Now, you know, we were blessed beyond measure. All we asked for was a quarter, and she gave us $1. Now, God has so much more to give than $1 when we trust Him. And He has a lot of secret ways of blessing us too, because I'll tell you another little story. And I was in college too, but it was one Sunday, and I gave all the money I had. It wasn't much. It might have been $1 and some change, but it was all I had. And that was all I had for the next week too. But before I left church that day, and I know many of you remember a gentleman in our church named Mr. Crovo Benton handed me a $20 bill. There was no reason for him to do that. It was not a birthday. It was not a graduation. It was no reason other than God knew that this little chick had just given him all the money she had and was going to be in a bad situation for a week. So I know how God blesses people because He's blessed me tremendously. But it's not just in wealth or in money that God can bless us. His promise here is not that He's going to make us wealthy, but He can certainly make us rich in many ways. And He can and He will provide for His people. But we have to trust Him to do that. Now, in verses 9 and 10, we go to another quatrain. It says, honor the Lord. I'm sorry. We've just done that one, 9 and 10. Let's go over to verses 11 and 12. That's the last quatrain. It's the sixth one. We only have 12 verses in the lesson today. And Solomon tells his son not to view discipline as a sign of anger, but as an act of love. Sometimes God's chastening can be difficult. When people are out of work and they face financial difficulties, it's easy to get angry with an instruction to give to God. And that's what it says in verse 11. My son, despise not the chastening of the Lord, neither be weary of His correction. Solomon knew that his son would also tire or get weary with instructions at times. And sometimes God's discipline seems to be a little bit tough. We might compare it to a soldier in boot camp. I've never been in boot camp, but I've seen some shows on TV or movies, and it looks like the drill sergeant is just trying to be mean. But then when you get to the end of the movie or end of the story, or maybe you get to the end of boot camp if you were there, he was not trying to be mean to the trainee or make him miserable. And he's not punishing that person because he's done something wrong, but he's preparing that soldier for the next phase of his military duty, his or her military duty. God knows our future and how we need to be prepared. And I sometimes like to talk about our life is like a jigsaw puzzle. And, you know, if you've ever put together a jigsaw puzzle, you look at the picture on the box, and that sort of it sort of directs you a little bit of how the pieces go together. But we don't get to see the picture of our life. We only are aware of the jigsaw puzzle piece that we have right now. And we want to fit it in place in our life. And sometimes we don't get to see the finished product, but God sees it, and He knows where that puzzle piece fits, where it fits, and how it fits into the finished product. And sometimes when we have prayers that aren't answered, it might be that the piece we're holding on to doesn't fit in our puzzle. It fits in somebody else's puzzle, or it's not the time to put that piece in place in our puzzle yet. But God sees the whole picture, and He directs where the puzzle piece and when the puzzle piece fits in. We don't know that. We don't know. But in verse 12, it says, for whom the Lord loveth, He correcteth, even as a father the son in whom he delighteth. It tells us that godly discipline is because of his love for us. You know, as parents, we discipline our children. We're not trying to be mean to them, but we're trying to teach them the way that they are to go. When Shep was little, he ended up out in the middle of the highway. And he hadn't done anything wrong, except he just drifted out in the road while I was not looking. And I switched his little legs all the way back to the house. But he knew not to go back in that highway again, because I did that because I loved him, not because I wanted to be mean, but I wanted him to learn, don't go in the highway. So just like we teach our children, and we have to discipline our children sometimes out of love, God disciplines us out of love. God really wants us to be the winner in the overall battle of our life. And that's the promise that comes with his correction. It's because he wants us to be the winner. Now, we get to the good part of the lesson, which is our self-evaluation and application. Now remember, this lesson title was Direction Offered. So I've got some questions that I want you to ask yourself and think about. And I've answered them myself. And I'm sorry to say that I've answered a lot of them in a way that I really would rather not have. Have you ever tried to put together a piece of furniture or anything that, for that matter, without looking at and reading the directions? Did you discover that you have to give up and actually do more than look at the picture? Have you ever attempted to repair something without really knowing for certain how to complete the project? You take it apart, you try to put it back together, you got some pieces and you don't remember where they came from, but you think you take it apart, you try to start this repair job and you think, well, I'll just figure it out along the way. And then you find out that you can't figure it out. That's not your skill. Have you ever been lost because you would not ask directions or you didn't listen to your GPS? The GPS is an acronym for, listen to this, Global Positioning System. It knows where you are, even if you don't. Another acronym has been associated with the word Bible. Think of the letters, B-I-B-L-E. Basic instruction before leaving Earth. Have you tried to live this life before checking on the basic instructions for it? Have you tried living it without reading the instructions or asking for directions? Are you just trying to figure it out along the way? These are the questions that each of us need to ponder for ourselves and evaluate within ourselves. God is our life GPS. He knows where we are, even if we don't know where we are, and he knows what road we need to take. And sometimes he'll nudge us back onto that road, but we have to accept the direction. He knows where we are, even when we don't, but we have to accept. It says direction offered. It's offered. We have to accept it. So I want to thank you for listening once again. I pray that you will be safe and that you will help keep others safe. And I pray that we will all be earnestly praying for our country and for our world. I'll be back next week if the Lord allows it, and I hope you will too. Thank you.